Historical Society has an annual meeting. We also coincide that with a featured lecture, and this year's presentation is a wonderful one to have, considering that we are in Westfield, right down the road from Barcelona. Michelle Henry is no stranger to people who study and are familiar with local history in Chautauqua County. Michelle started her career in the history field as director of the County Historical Society. In 1996, she was hired by County Clerk Sandy Sopak to organize the historical records held by the county. In 2000, she was appointed county historian, a position she held until her retirement in 2023. She was also a longtime County Historical Society trustee, serving on the board until spring 2025, but her presence is still felt to this day because of all the work that she had done as part of our board. In 2011, Henry was awarded the Julia Reinstein Award for Excellence in the Field of Public History, and in 2012, she received the Wheeler B. Melius Award for Excellence in Establishing a Records Management Program for the county. She has also served as a consultant for the state's Museum Collections Assessment Program, providing assistance and advice to small museums across Western New York. Today, she is currently, and I have it on here, Michelle, your official title with States Parks?
Research historian.
Research historian for the State Office of Parks and Historic Preservation. So it's a pleasure to always have Michelle do a presentation. We're very fortunate to have her do her presentation on the early history of Barcelona Harbor today. So without further ado, a round of applause for Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Historical Society for asking me to speak about this. I've been really immersed in the history of Barcelona for the last year and a half, and it's been such a learning experience, and it's just so fascinating. I want to thank Judy Hess, and I realize she's no longer with us, but the Judy Hess collection is now at the County Historical Society, and it's such a valuable resource for information about Barcelona. And Judy spent decades, I think, researching Barcelona and gathering information about it, and it's just a treasure, and we're very lucky to have it. I also want to ask Christine Wilson to stand up. She is the new site manager at the Barcelona Lighthouse. Christine. Very happy to have her there. She's a history enthusiast, so she and I get into these lengthy conversations about history, and it's really fun to have her there, and I'm really excited, and they're doing great things there. I hope you all have a chance to stop down to the lighthouse and see all the work going on and the improvements there. This image is at the lighthouse. It's from the Chautauqua County Historical Society's collection, and unfortunately, we don't know who painted it or when, but it's just such a charming image. I thought I would use it in this talk. It just is a nice little idyllic glimpse of what the lighthouse looked like about 100 years ago. So before I can even talk about Barcelona, though, I just want to talk a little bit about Western New York and how it was settled and transportation in general. So let's see if I can do this. So there's a couple early Holland Land Company maps. And I used the spelling the way they were worded on the maps themselves. And you can see these were maps of roads. And so the only road, there's an Indian path going east and west along the northern end of Chautauqua County, northern end of Westfield. And then there's the road cut by the French. So there really were no other roads or paths through Chautauqua County, which of course made it difficult to get here. And so in 1804, Timothy Dwight journeyed through Chautauqua County, and he wrote, "The stumps and roots were innumerable and singularly perplexing and dangerous. The mud through most of the district was knee-deep and often so stiff as to make it impossible for a horse to extract himself without extreme labor." In 1820, a Washington, D.C. newspaper picked up a piece from the Chautauqua Gazette, and it said, "We observe that a company of 100 men from the northern towns of Chautauqua County are about to volunteer a week's work in the praiseworthy object of improving the road through the 4 Mile Woods, a piece of road which is well known to be the worst in the western country and which at some seasons is almost impassable. Apparently it took an entire day to just get across those 4 miles. which were right on the other side of Cattaraugus Creek, coming into Chautauqua County, along the northern end of the county. So that was in 1820. At the end of the 1820s, in the Fredonia Censor, we find that the citizens of Chautauqua County have petitioned New York State. And the petition says, in part, "It is true that the road complained of is not in the county of Chautauqua, but it is the only channel of communication between this county and the rest of the state. Cornered up here as we are in the western extremity of the state, with Lake Erie and Pennsylvania almost surrounding us, we have no means of communication with the community to which we belong, except through 30 miles of the worst road in the world." This road needs no description. The long line of travelers who have waded through it within the last 15 years have spread its fame to every part of the United States, and the 4 Mile Woods are as extensively known as Hurlgate or the Dismal Swamp, which were two areas on the East Coast that were treacherous to immigrants. The people of this county and of Erie have endeavored by voluntary contributions to make the road passable, and the proprietors of the mail stages have expended about $800 on it, but the task is too great for individual means. So an early mail carrier was writing about his experiences. At a later date, he submitted a letter to the Jamestown newspaper. Unfortunately, he didn't sign his name, he just signed it as correspondent. But he said, "The road from Buffalo to Fredonia was mostly on the shores of the lake, and we used to swim the horses and mail wagons around the projecting rocks. And many a time have I buffeted the rough waves as they came round the rocky points, full into the stage, with only Uncle Sam's mail bags for a fender." Not sure Uncle Sam would have appreciated that. "The quicksands on the lake shore were a great terror to immigrants. I have frequently seen for miles teams and wagons stuck in the quicksand, many of them in dangerous situations." So that was, well into the 1820s. So I think it kind of helps us understand why water was seen as a perhaps easier form of transportation, because the roads here were just non-existent or impassable. So the Holland Land Company surveyed Chautauqua County, and they designated 3 places in the county where they anticipated there to be a larger settlement. And so there were 3 spots that they surveyed into village lots rather than just the regular lot and range lots. And so those, you can probably guess, any of you who know history, would be Mayville, because that was already designated as the county seat. It was also at the head of Chautauqua Lake and at the southern end of the Portage Road. Portland, because it was a sort of a natural harbor on Lake Erie. And the third was Irving, because it was on Cattaraugus Creek, which was considered to be a navigable creek. And what everybody was concerned about was finding a place to take safe harbor in the event of a storm. So those were the 3 places that the land company anticipated there being growth. So this is an early map of Portland Village. You can see it's surveyed into village lots rather than the larger lots. And there's a couple things about this that are interesting. You can see the little lots along the inside of the harbor. Those were surveyed as water lots in 1811, because I think they anticipated there being development at the harbor for the movement of goods and people. And the term or the name Portland shows up as early as 1810, and maybe even earlier in the Holland Land Company records. So I know I've heard people say that the Portland Harbor was named after the town of Portland, and I think it's reverse. I think maybe the town of Portland, because that didn't exist in 1810, this would have been in the town of Chautauqua. So I think maybe the town of Portland was named after Portland Harbor, but you can beat me up later if you don't agree. And I don't know where the name Portland came from. I mean, it was already being used by the Holland Land Company in 1810, and those lots were surveyed in 1811. So people wanted to use the water, they wanted to use the lake, but this was the western frontier. And travel by boat on the lake was a new experience. And so a lot of the boats that were used in creeks and rivers and smaller lakes were flat boats. And those just didn't work well on Chautauqua Lake. The first boat that we are aware of that was coursing Lake Erie was the Washington, which was made in Erie by Eliphalet Beebe. And according to the Centennial History of Chautauqua County, the Washington was the first sailing vessel to touch at Portland Harbor. In 1799, William Lee built the Good Intent in Erie, and I believe Zatu Cushing was one of the carpenters who worked on that boat. It was lost in 1806 with all on board. In 1800, Eliphalet Beebe built the Harlequin and lost her in the first season with all on board. It was dangerous to use the lake. And it really demonstrated the need to have safe harbors that you could get to in the event of a fast storm. The first steamboat navigating Lake Erie was the Walk in the Water. And it was launched in August of 1818 at Black Rock. It made it to Detroit, which is over 300 miles from Buffalo, in 48 hours. It did not have a steam whistle. They hadn't been invented yet, so apparently it signaled its arrival and departure at port with a cannon blast. It was fueled by wood, as were all steamboats up through the 1840s. And it was painted bright white, green, and gold, and had figurehead of Oliver Hazard Perry on the front of it. So by 1818, when this was launched, there were already 25 other vessels on the American side of Lake Erie, and they were all small and engaged in freighting along the shore from Buffalo to Detroit. And even at that time, newspapers were expressing the need for safe harbors. And the Walk in the Water was actually lost in a storm in November of 1821. I'm going to mention November a lot, and you know, Gordon Lightfoot wasn't lying when he talked about the gales in November, because so many of our horrific storms and our loss of lives and ships was in November. And I think you can kind of boil it down to greed on the part of the shipping lines and the ship captains to try to get one more trip up the lake before the lake closed for the season, and it often resulted in the loss of incredible amount of money and goods, and also in lives. So in 1819, I don't know if that shows up very well, but that is the very first improvement that I have found at Portland Harbor. That was done in 1819 by the Holland Land Company, and at the top is the Holland Land Company ledger that William Peacock created, showing his expense to create the breakwater. He says breakwater or wharf. And he drew this map later. He drew it in 1823, but the drawing shows, which I think is really fascinating because it shows the very first improvement. That whole tip that's speckled, it didn't exist naturally. But they extended off the point that was there by using log cribs, and they filled them with rocks, and they made this wharf, which was 495 feet long and 24 feet wide. So I suspect it was after this was constructed that the Walk in the Water made its way to Portland Harbor. I don't know for sure, but there was another person who submitted recollections to the Jamestown paper, and he wrote, "I well remember the first steamboat on Lake Erie. What a wonderful sight it was. All the inhabitants of Portland Harbor, about 20, ran to the bank of the lake to see her. In she came, puffing and blowing through the rough billows of Lake Erie with perfect safety. The honest expression of the inhabitants was truly native." So right around that time, the first steamboat visited the harbor. In November of 1819, the schooner Kingbird, which was loaded with salt, was headed for Portland Harbor from Buffalo. It was lost in a storm. The first water lot that I can find a record of a purchase for was by James Ray in 1821. So he bought water lot number 1, which is the northernmost of the, I don't know if they're on there, of those water lots. And he built a warehouse there. So the warehouse and commission business was, already starting to pick up. And in 1823, when Peacock drew this map, he drew it because George Fowle from Erie was asking for permission to buy 40 feet of land at the very tip of that breakwater to build a warehouse. And so George Fowle offered $25 to the Holland Land Company to purchase that, and he offered to gravel the top of that breakwater so that he could get a team of horses out there to bring goods in and out. I don't know if he was given permission. Peacock wrote in his letter that he thought they should charge $40 and that he should have all of the work done before the lake opened for the next season. And I don't know for sure that that happened. But I think it kind of indicates as well that already there were more people coming to the harbor and looking at it as a shipping port. So, and this is all before the Erie Canal. So a lot of what you read about Portland Harbor says that, it grew or it became an important harbor because of the Erie Canal opening. But actually before the Erie Canal, it was already a pretty busy place. This, gotta love the handwriting. This is a ledger from a business in Westfield called Budlong and Babcock. This is in the collection of the County Historical Society. And it is just the most fascinating glimpse of what was coming and going through the harbor into Westfield. So the ledger starts in 1821, and really hard to read, but you can see in the upper left-hand corner that George Fowle's wharfmen were buying tobacco. And it says, as per his wharfmen. So they were either buying it for George Fowle or George Fowle was paying for the tobacco. But it was the wharfmen who were showing up to buy it. There's also a teapot. One of the most common charges was for whiskey. Brandy and rum were more expensive because they had to be freighted in, but throughout these ledgers you can find tobacco, thread, buttons, tea, leather. They were trading grain for whiskey. They were exporting black salts. So James Ray was credited by paid freight 12 shillings for a potash kettle. So they were charging things in pounds and shillings, but they were also extending credit in dollars and cents. In 1825, which is still before the canal opened, that didn't open until October, the steamboat Pioneer was stopping regularly at Portland Harbor on trips up and down the lake. And the Good Intent, I think this must have been the second Good Intent because the first one went down, was enrolled at Portland Harbor. And so that meant that was naming Portland Harbor as its home port. The Good Intent went down on December 2nd. All hands were lost. It was carrying 140 barrels of salt. These ships that went down, because the lake was pretty shallow, were often salvaged because it was more economical to try to salvage a ship and whatever might have been on it than to rebuild new. So I actually found the next summer there was a Good Intent on the lake, and it might have been salvaged from the one that went down in December. In 1826, Henry Abel, Asa Farnsworth, and George Fowle partnered together and bought the wharf with the 40 feet at the end of the Holland Land Company's warehouse, and they also bought 2 storehouses that were owned by James Ray. So, lots of business, more people coming there, and building warehouses and opening storage and commission businesses. Still no federal appropriations for harbor improvements, even though it's talked about a lot in the newspapers at the time. With the opening of the Erie Canal, I think it finally became apparent to the federal government that the Great Lakes were going to be vital for westward expansion. So there was an appropriation in 1826 by Congress to survey the Great Lakes to see where there were improvements needed. We didn't get any money right away, but there's another resource that is just great, and it's these marine lists that were printed in the Western Star, 1826. And it shows the ships that were coming in each week, what they were carrying, who the captain was, and then the ships that were cleared and left. So you can see that the schooner Milan arrived on June 4th from Erie with passengers. The schooner Liberty came from Buffalo with merchandise for Abel and Farnsworth, and also for goods for J. Barker and Budlong and Babcock, which was the store I mentioned earlier. The Milan left and headed for Buffalo with sundries. The Liberty left, headed for Buffalo with flour, ashes, whiskey, wood, oil, and sugar. So these are really a wealth of information, and you can kind of see how much activity was going on at Portland Harbor before there was any federal money for improvements, but this would have been after the Erie Canal was open. So just a fascinating way to learn more about it. And then you can see these ads for the storage and forwarding and commission businesses. There was, Buffalo Beer by George Fowle available, plaster and flour and pork from Knapp and Eason. And that one, that's one of my personal favorites because when I was doing research on the McClurgs, and I found that James McClurg's son married Gilbert Knapp's daughter, and Knapp was from Racine, Wisconsin, and all of his biographies, he's the founding father of Racine, Wisconsin, and all of his biographies just mentioned that he, might have been somewhere in western New York before he left. And he was here. He was at Portland Harbor. He owned a house at Barcelona, or at Portland Harbor. He was in business with John Eason, who would have been McClurg's nephew, son of David Eason. And he left Portland Harbor in 1834, and Eason took over his house and the business. So this was fun for me to find because it was like proof that he was here. He was here in the 1820s right up until 1834. So we know a little bit more about Gilbert Knapp than we did before. So in 1826, 150 vessels entered and cleared the harbor, with 950 barrels of ashes, 600 barrels of flour, 500 barrels of whiskey, over 2,000 bushels of wheat, 2,200 barrels of salt, and we shipped out oil, pork, hops, and lumber. And that was a newspaper article talking about the growing commerce on the lake, and they said there were 6 steamers and 100 sailboats regularly plying the shores of Lake Erie. And they said as the Western Great Lakes develop, Lake Erie will become the medium of conveying products from the upper country to the great commercial outlets, meaning, to the East Coast. And the editor thanked Congress for promoting the interests of the growing West. In 1826, Thomas McHenry, who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, traveled up the lake, and he wrote, "A word about Lake Erie. All my previous conception of a lake fell so short of its actual vastness and ocean-like appearance as to be wholly absorbed in the view of it. Lake Erie is a vast sea and often more stormy and even more dangerous than the ocean itself." And in 1826, in November, there was a horrible gale. The water rose so rapidly, and according to the newspaper, and to such fearful heights that ships were lucky to have made it into port. The original Holland Land Company pier was damaged. There was another gale in April of 1827, and the old pier was completely carried away. However, 1827, Eliphalet Tinker had built a new pier which was not damaged. They found a schooner off of Barcelona. I call it Barcelona, Portland Harbor. Sorry, I keep going back and forth. It's still Portland Harbor at this time. The captain was dead, entangled in the rigging. All the rest of the crew were gone and presumed dead. So that was a severe gale in November of 1826. And an engineering report from the time period, who was, the Army Corps of Engineers did all of the surveys of the harbors at that time because we didn't have civil engineers available to do the work, and they felt it was good training for the Army Corps of Engineers because they said that the harbors were important if we needed them for defense. So they were the ones that did the first surveys of the harbor, and the engineer reported, unfortunately, the frequency of severe storms meant regular and expensive repairs to the wharves, breakwaters, and warehouses in the harbor, in addition to the loss of goods, vessels, and lives when a storm prevented a ship's captain from making it in safely. So, once again, stressing the need for safe harbors. I just want to give you an idea. This is a picture from the Judy Hess collection, and someone was nice enough to write on the bottom, making of a crib. So this is a much later time period, but the principles basically were the same. So they kind of constructed a crib the same way you'd make a log cabin, making a square box out of logs, and then you would either float them out into place and fill them with rocks, or around here we often drag them out onto the ice in the winter, fill them with rocks, and then when the ice melted, they'd sink into location. And so they would get a string of these cribs together, and then they would build a timber superstructure over the top of them that would extend 6 or 7 feet out of the water. They would fill those with gravel, and then they would plank over them. And so that was how the early piers and the breakwaters were built. So the problem was, most of them were higher than they were wide. There was a lot of experimentation going on because it was kind of a whole new process dealing with Lake Erie. And so they really weren't strong enough to withstand the wind and the ice and the weather here on Lake Erie. So let's see, I'll leave that for a minute. Right around the same time period, in June of 1827, so June, you know, what a lovely time of year to be on the lake, William Peacock wrote about his first steamboat ride. And he said, "Thus did I pass from Buffalo to Erie in 12.5 hours. At first thought it seems impossible to be in Buffalo at 9:30 in the morning and arrive at Erie at 10 at night without any exertion on my part. In fact, I was all the time enjoying the comforts of a well-regulated hotel. But so is the fact. It was a most singular and extraordinary day to me." So he had a lovely ride on the lake. So that was nice for William Peacock. In 1827, Portland Harbor was declared port of entry, which gave it a customs presence, which I've not been able to find much about. But it was declared a port of entry. A post office was established, and it was Eliphalet Tinker who had built that warehouse, who was named postmaster, and the post office was operated out of his warehouse. So there's Tinker advertising his warehouse. Gideon Goodrich is going to ask for permission to purchase land to build a warehouse. Goodrich and Fowle is another company that was offering business at the harbor. This was built in 1827. It was, I mean, to me, it's just so impressive to think there was enough business even by that time to warrant having a hotel and tavern that was this large. Built in 1827, it was known as Groats Inn. You can kind of see that above the doorway. There's a little bit of paint left. Walker Inn, or the Barcelona Inn. And unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1964. Also in 1827, there was an interesting article in the newspaper indicating that gas had been discovered issuing out of a rock in the bank nearly opposite the storehouses. So that would have been east of the harbor. Goodrich, Fowle and Company are excavating the rock from the top of the bank with the intention of raising it up on a pedestal as a substitute for a lighthouse. So even before we had a lighthouse and before we did anything with the natural gas nearby, there were men that were experimenting with it, trying to use it in the absence of a lighthouse. That same year, the Holland Land Company gave credit on land contracts for work done repairing the wharf. And also in 1828, federal funds were allocated for the lighthouse to be built. I'll get to that in a minute. I have to talk about the lighthouse. This is the Exchange House. This was built in 1829, and it was named that because apparently they could exchange British and American currency. Built by Job Lewis, it was on the southeast corner of Route 5 and Portage, and stood until 1945. So, you know, there again, I just think it's remarkable that we had these two pretty substantial hotels and inns and taverns that were needed to accommodate all the people coming and going through Portland Harbor. Finally, in 1829, we see the survey that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers for improvements at the harbor. And this is a wonderful map because it shows what was currently in existence, the two piers coming off of the Holland Land Company breakwater, and then the proposed improvements which were out in the lake as breakwaters. So, and this is nice too because it does show that the lighthouse is there. So, so we have our lighthouse. Now, the same year, 1829, the town of Westfield was established. And I found some references to Eliphalet Tinker and Joshua Tinker suggesting the name of Westfield for the town. Their family hailed from Westfield, Massachusetts. So I suspect that that is where the town got its name, and the village was already being referred to as Westfield earlier than that. So, maybe they picked that name for the town because the settlement in that town was already being referred to as Westfield earlier on. Once again, beat me up if you don't agree, I don't know.
It was the Westfield of Portland.
No,
Yes, it was.
well,
Yeah. That,
I feel like
yeah.
town names were not that inconsequential. I feel like most people, when they were picking the name for their town, they were naming it after some important
Or the
person or
village.
important place.
Yeah.
And so, I feel like the town of Westfield wasn't just named because it was
They named
Westfield.
the post office in the 18 of Westfield, which was where the village was starting to develop.
Well, anyway, so there were some references I found that said that the Tinkers suggested the name Westfield. They were from Westfield, Massachusetts. A lot of our other communities were named after
Okay.
places people had come from,
All right.
or important people. So,
Michelle, could you point to the lighthouse? I don't see it on this.
Uh-huh.
Ah, yes,
That
thank
was
you.
it.
so it makes sense that the lighthouse was there because the original harbor was right here, So this was the original harbor to the east of the point, and the lighthouse was directly above it. So the steamboat William Peacock was built that year. It was built here in Westfield, or in Barcelona, by the Buffalo and Portland Steamboat Company. It took its maiden journey to Buffalo, but in September 1830, the boiler exploded as it was leaving Buffalo, and 15 people died, and they were mostly immigrants. So that company dissolved in 1830, but there was a steamboat building presence here, and I found a reference to it as early as 1827 in that Budlong and Babcock ledger. So I think there might have been other steamboats built here as well. So the lighthouse. That is not a diagram of our lighthouse, but it matches it pretty darn close. This is an 1827 illustration from the National Archives of a lighthouse design. And so the Bureau of Lighthouses gave very specific instructions as to how the lighthouse and the light were to be constructed. And so Peacock selected the site, they bought the land from the Holland Land Company. He hired Thomas Campbell to do the construction. So it's made of split stone, it's 40 feet high, it's 60 feet above the water. The walls at the base are 3.5 feet thick, they're 2 feet thick at the top. And the light on the right has more lights in it, but I liked it because it's color and it kind of illustrates what the original light at the top of the lighthouse would have looked like. It's called like birdcage style. And the original descriptions for our lighthouse sound just like this, with a copper top, domed, 8-sided, with 21 panes of glass on each of the 8 sides. The glass came from the Boston Glass Manufacturing Company in Boston. The light fixtures for all of the lighthouses in the United States were patented by a man named Winslow Lewis. So he held the patent. The federal government paid him $20,000 in 1812 for that patent. So, so they were using his lights. What's interesting, I think, too, about this, there's another picture. This is a typical Winslow Lewis lamp from 1810. That's basically what we had. A place for the whale oil, a reflector behind it, and then the lights projected out. Our light was 11 individual lights, 6 on the bottom, 5 on top, that projected one light out into the harbor. This is also an illustration of a lighthouse cottage. It's not exactly ours, but it's really close. And since I found it in the records, I thought I would just share it with you. We have a central chimney, not a chimney on the side, and we only have one window on each side of the central door. But the original cottage very much looked like that. It was 34 by 20 feet, It had what they called a porch extending off of the east side, which was actually the kitchen, so there was a stove in there. There was a well dug and an outhouse. So that is what the lighthouse keeper was given to live in when our lighthouse was completed in 1829. Let me just see what's next here. I like these images because I think this is the very earliest image we have of the lighthouse. Unfortunately, we don't have any images of the tower when it still had a light in it, but it was decommissioned in 1859, so that's really early in photographic history to have a photograph. But I did find one of the Buffalo Lighthouse in 1859, so I'm really hopeful that someday somebody will find a picture of our lighthouse. But this image is nice. The fence is still mostly intact, more intact than in any of the other photos that are later. The cottage does not have any additions on it yet. And what I like about these is it shows how much plaster was still left on the outside, because the lighthouse and the keeper's cottage were whitewashed with white paint the entire time that they were in operation. And I just think it's so hard for us to imagine it now, but the lighthouse, and when they inspected it annually, they would say that, you know, you need to put another coat of whitewash on this. And so they were covered in Roman cement and then whitewashed for their entire history of operation. So this shows you just how much of that white was left on the lighthouse after it was no longer in use. And you can kind of see how the building has deteriorated. There's holes in the roof of the tower. So it wasn't used at that time, obviously. So as soon as the lighthouse was completed and lit with whale oil, apparently Thomas Campbell and William Hart from Fredonia and Charles Tupper formed a partnership to bring natural gas to the lighthouse. Now, Charles Tupper owned the property where the creek was located that had the natural gas issuing out of it, and that's now Ottaway Park. So William Hart built this contraption. It was a 40-foot in diameter masonry cone in the creek to capture the gas, and then they had wooden pipes to carry it to the lighthouse. So apparently William Hart had tried that in Dunkirk, bringing gas from the creek in Fredonia, but because, you gotta think about this, the lighthouse was lower than Fredonia, they couldn't get the gas to travel down through the pipes. But because our lighthouse was at a higher elevation than the gas coming out of the creek, they were able to transport it to the lighthouse uphill because the gas is lighter than air. So, we find, I'm getting ahead of myself here. There was an article in the newspaper that's on July 5th of 1830 that said, "Last evening we had the pleasure of witnessing the most beautiful light we've ever saw, which was no other than light issuing from the lighthouse at Portland Harbor, which was illuminated for the first time with natural gas brought in wooden conductors from the fountainhead, a distance about a half a mile. The lighting of the gas was announced by the iron thunders of one of the very same guns that did such signal service for Commodore Perry in 1813. This new method of illuminating the lighthouse will be a great savings to government, and the light from the gas is much preferable to the light from lamps, as it burns much clearer and can be seen at a greater distance." However, we had a 3-year contract for whale oil with the Bureau of Lighthouses, and this apparently was done without the knowledge or consent of the Lighthouse Bureau, switching to natural gas. And apparently the first lighthouse keeper, Joshua Lane, wasn't thrilled about it. And so Lane wrote to Stephen Pleasanton and asked if there had been a contract for natural gas. And Pleasanton was, this is Pleasanton. He looks pleasant. Pleasanton was the 5th auditor of the United States Treasury, which was the department that oversaw all of the lighthouses in the United States. And I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but he was given this important federal position with absolutely no experience or training in anything to do with navigation or lighthouses or lights. So the reason he got his job is because he's credited with saving all of the important documents from the Capitol when the British were about to storm the Capitol in 1814 and burn the White House. And so Stephen Pleasanton and a group of men were told to get the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They grabbed all that stuff, George Washington's correspondence, and they put them in plain sacks and took them to Virginia and hid them from the British. So he deserves credit for that. But he really had no idea what was necessary for safe harbors or lighthouses. And he was very committed to Winslow Lewis and his light. So, Campbell wrote to Stephen Pleasanton and asked for a contract to provide gas to the lighthouse. And Campbell wanted to be paid for the gas, for the pipes, for the structure at the creek, for the time and efforts of him and his partners, as well as delivering the gas. And Pleasanton was very, very frugal. And he wrote back, "It would be desirable if the light be more brilliant and luminous as you seem to think it is. But as the light from oil will answer every useful purpose, it is proper to inform you that we cannot give more for the gas light annually than we now pay for oil. For the apparatus for conducting the gas to the lighthouse and keeping it repaired, nothing can be allowed, unless you will receive the oil lamps and other fixtures which recently cost $650 and would be useless in the event of adopting gas light. Before a contract could be entered into, however, it will be necessary for you to forward satisfactory evidence to the brilliancy and utility of the gas light." So I don't know what Campbell did, but he was able to get a contract starting in January of 1831 to provide natural gas to the lighthouse, but he was only given $213 a year, which is exactly what they had contracted for the whale oil. So he didn't get any additional funds for that. And Joshua Lane was, for whatever reason, was not happy about it, and he wrote to Pleasanton and said that I'm getting complained about because people are saying the light isn't sufficient, but it's not me, it's the gas. And Thomas Campbell wrote to President Andrew Jackson and complained that Joshua Lane was hostile to him and his gas interest. He claimed that Lane neglected to keep the light burning and that he was anti-Masonic. And he asked that Lane be removed and that Charles Tupper be appointed as lighthouse keeper. So this kind of went on back and forth. I can find bits and pieces of the correspondence. Lane was trying to get people that said, Stephen Pleasanton told him to get disinterested people to support his claims that the gas light was not sufficient. And Campbell at one point even threatened to cancel the contract Pleasanton threatened to cancel the contract, and he actually even told his, whoever worked for him, to contact Winslow Lewis to provide a Lewis lamp again. And then also they required Campbell to put down lead pipes instead of wooden. But, so anyway, I think at most of the time that we did have the gas lamps. And Lane resigned due to poor health in 1843, and then Nathaniel Bird was appointed. He was 80 years old. I just really find that surprising, but he might have been a real spry 80-year-old. He resigned when he was able to get a Revolutionary War pension because he was a Revolutionary War soldier. And so he resigned in 1845, and Lane was actually reappointed, but then he died in March of 1846. And then we have Joshua Ledoux for 3 years, and then Richard Kenyon, who was a War of 1812 veteran. They really like to appoint veterans to the lighthouse positions. And then Thomas Taylor, and then William Britton was the last lighthouse keeper. He was the keeper when it was decommissioned in 1859. There's some cute anecdotes about Joshua Lane. When he was appointed, they said he was a deaf, superannuated minister. And I guess that just means he had a pension. So he was, they said he had a lot of female dependents. He had more sons than daughters, but it was the females that really, I guess, sold him needing to be appointed lighthouse keeper. He had 10 children, and several born at the lighthouse while he was there. Joshua Ledoux had, I think, I don't know, 12 to 14 kids. I'm trying to track them all down. It's kind of hard. So there were a lot of people living in that little cottage. Okay, so let's get back to the harbor. I'm just showing this again because we finally in 1831 got $10,000 to try to work on the harbor as proposed in this survey. And cribs were built in the winter. The newspaper reported that Portland Harbor had 3 new docks and 4 new warehouses, and that several steamers were regularly running between Portland Harbor and Buffalo. So 1832, people in Westfield petitioned New York State to build a railroad to Mayville from Portland Harbor. And their justification was that Portland Harbor is the great depot of an extensive, rich, and fertile country. Vessels of the largest class on Lake Erie enter and clear with perfect ease and safety. It is the great loading place for all the community carried into the southern, eastern, and western part of the county in Pennsylvania. The harbor is nearer to southern navigable waters than any other point on the Great Lakes. In that same year, they reported that merchants received 1,450 tons of merchandise into Portland Harbor, 320 tons of furniture, 4,045 bushels of salt, 2,000 tons of limestone, and that we shipped out wheat, flour, corn, whiskey, beef, pork, butter and cheese, tallow, wood, oats, cherry lumber, 2,000 bushels of ashes. So a lot of commerce here, and the railroad obviously didn't happen, but the justification for it really gives us a good idea of how much activity there was here at the harbor. In 1832, the schooner Postboy was built at Portland Harbor. We didn't get any appropriations that year. In 1833, the schooner New Connecticut capsized near the harbor and went ashore just below the lighthouse. The crew got out safely, but the captain's aunt had been below deck when it flipped, and they all assumed she was drowned. And the lake was so rough that they couldn't get back to board it for 5 days. And when they did board it and they were trying to right it, his aunt popped out from below deck, and the captain almost fainted. He was so shocked to see her, and she had survived by eating an onion that had floated by. She was taken to Eliphalet Tinker's house, where she recuperated for 3 days and then went on her merry way. So quite a tale to tell. Apparently, as the overturned ship was rocking and bobbing in the water, she could hear things knocking and moving around, and she assumed it was the folks coming to rescue her, and so she just waited. Yeah. So good for her. She had faith. So once again, in 1833, local residents appealed to Congress for money to improve Portland Harbor, and they said that residents of Pennsylvania and New York State are dependent on Portland Harbor as a place of embarkation of their agricultural products for market and a place of debarkation for large quantities of merchandise, salt, and iron. It was a point of national importance. And they said that there were 50,000 people who were moving west on Lake Erie that year, not all coming through here, but still 50,000 passengers on the lake that year. And in 1834, we got $11,500 for the harbor. There were over 200 vessels on the lake employed in trade, 35 American steamboats. The schooner Jefferson was enrolled at Portland Harbor, and an article in the Westfield Farmer said, "We have no doubt that Portland Harbor is destined to become one of the most important points on the lake. So strongly has nature pointed it out as a connecting point with the valley of the Mississippi. Some wealthy citizens of this county and Buffalo and Erie have purchased real estate and are commencing extensive and important improvements." And they pointed out in October that the Portland Harbor Land Company was proceeding rapidly with improvements to the harbor, and they had plans to build several stores the next season. So, what do you think happened in November? In November, they had the severest gale ever to date hit Portland Harbor. 2 men, William McHenry and Thomas Crossgrove, went out to that warehouse at the tip of the Hull Land Company's pier to try to secure goods. By the time they got out there, the storm had gotten so bad that their access back had been washed away, so they were stranded out there. And people on shore tried to take boats out to rescue them, and they couldn't. The lake was too rough, the storm was too bad. They said for 3 hours, people on shore watched as this warehouse just got beaten to the point where they saw it fall into the lake. The two men jumped from the warehouse into the lake and were both swept away and drowned. The paper said it was an appalling scene of devastation and ruin. All but one storehouse was destroyed. The old wharf was swept away with its contents. The storm was so bad that the base of the lighthouse was being washed by the waves. So that's really hard to imagine, the storm waters coming that far into the harbor and reaching that high up the cliffs. They said the wharves have all been stripped of their plank wood. Everything piled on them was lost. So this Portland Harbor Company, which was a lot of local men and then also men from Erie and Buffalo, had been established to try to build more piers and warehouses, and actually what they ended up wanting to do is rebuild what had been destroyed. And for whatever reason, they were not allowed to incorporate with the intention of building piers and docks. They were only given permission to buy and sell lots within the village of Portland and make improvements thereon. So I don't really understand the justification for that, except in the hearing, some of the folks in Congress were saying that the docks had all been built pretty much, or the warehouses, with private money, and we want to encourage that to continue to happen, so we're not going to intercede. So, you know, there's major damage here. So I suspect what happened is these folks who were part of this Portland Harbor Company decided to try to make an even bigger harbor. And so they moved their efforts west of the point. And that year we received $11,500 in appropriations from the federal government. And they began in August to build this 600-foot pier west of the new harbor off of what was called Peacock Grove or Peacock Point. The government agent who was overseeing the work said, "This spacious harbor is a demonstration of the great and growing importance of this beautiful section of our state as it's beginning to be developed." And it was at this same time that the name was changed to Barcelona. And I believe it was because Isaac Smith, who was part of that harbor improvement company, proposed that name. His wharf, which is the long wharf sticking off of the original point, was called the Barcelona Wharf. He had been to Barcelona, he had traveled extensively. Interestingly, they're both kind of on the same latitude, Barcelona, Spain, and Barcelona, New York. And at that time in the newspaper, there was a lot of information being covered about the Civil War in Spain. A lot of that fighting was going on at and around Barcelona. And so there seemed to be a lot of interest in what was happening there. So I think that is why they picked Barcelona as the name for the harbor. I know there's been some articles written about a French term that was on one of the French maps from that area that sounded similar to Barcelona. But I don't believe those French maps were discovered in the Paris archives until 1886. And so I think that postdates the naming of Barcelona. But there again, there's other stories out there about how that name came to be. John Eason advertised that he had rebuilt his wharf and placed his warehouse upon a new and substantial foundation, that he would be prepared for business the next season. In 1837, they got $10,000 more. All winter long, teams were engaged in hauling timber to build the breakwater. 2 log storehouses were built on that new long pier. Butter and cheese were shipped to markets from it. And the superintendent of public works wrote that the original works to secure harbors were but experiments built of perishable material. Unless it is made permanent, the elements will speedily render useless all that has been found of such benefit to the commerce of the West. Navigation on the lake is difficult and dangerous, and the federal appropriations have entirely changed this. And millions of acres of land in western New York, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Michigan owe their settlement to the federal appropriations, so basically to making safe harbors. Although I don't know that we changed our construction any. I mean, we were still building wooden cribs and we were still filling them with stone and then planking over them. So this map is very similar to the map I just showed you, which was from 1836. This is 1838. And in 1838, we got $35,466 for the harbor. And the report that accompanied it said, a wharf called Barcelona Wharf projects 600 feet from the shore. The area enclosed by these new works will be about 434 acres, of which there will be upwards of an acre of anchorage. The progress made is as follows. There's 1,200 running feet of pier extending to the west. Only a small number of the cribs have been filled to the height intended, and those that were filled to the surface of the water in 1837 had all of their stones swept out over the winter. But there's no doubt that this harbor will be greatly improved by the government work now in progress. Under existing circumstances, the large class of steamboats rarely, if ever, venture in during a storm. But when it is completed, it may not only be the means of saving much valuable shipping, but to give a fresh impulse to trade. So this work started in 1836. In 1838, there was a November storm. 25 vessels went ashore between Erie and Buffalo. I haven't found much information about the damage here, but you have to assume there was some damage. In 1839, $23,000 was appropriated for the harbor, and they said work was underway. They erected a workshop that was 70 by 20 feet, and they said this was a very suitable harbor for commerce. It was vital. The New York Statesman at that same time wrote that Lake Erie literally commands the navigable waters of North America. It may be regarded as a great central reservoir from which open in all directions the most extensive channels of inland navigation to be found in the world, enabling vessels of Lake Erie to traverse the whole interior of the country. The value of shipping on Lake Erie that year was $2.4 million, and this commerce is possible because of suitable harbors. In 1840, another $10,000 was appropriated for the harbor, and I just think it's kind of interesting to mention that right around this time period, we had an important visitor. I always like to try to find things in our local history that connect us to larger national events. And in 1837, 1838, there was a rebellion in Canada, and some Americans went over and fought with the rebels. There were some extradition issues that we were fighting with Canada about, but we didn't want to go to war with Canada, so Daniel Webster was the Secretary of State, and he was sent to try to negotiate a treaty with Lord Ashburton. But before he did that, apparently he secretly came to Chautauqua County to confer with Donald Mackenzie, who was an expert on the northern parts of our country and the southern parts of Canada. So there's Daniel Webster. I wouldn't want to negotiate with him. And Donald Mackenzie. And so apparently he came into Barcelona Harbor. He was met by William Peacock's fine carriage, transported to Mayville, where he spent 1 or 2 nights with Mackenzie, and then he went back and was able to establish the northern boundary of the United States from Maine to Minnesota. And they also came up with an agreement about the extradition, and they also established navigation rights for both countries on the Great Lakes. So the boundary we have today is the same boundary that he negotiated with Ashburton, and might have been due in part to whatever information he learned from Donald Mackenzie. So we're going to take credit for that. So it's another map. I like maps. And I like this because it shows the hopes that this new breakwater will get extended almost all the way to the end of the Barcelona Pier. But I like it because it also shows the remnants of that earlier breakwater that I think was destroyed in one of those earlier storms. But they show it is still possibly existing. Maybe some of the cribs were still visible or being used. I don't really know. In 1841, the schooner President was built and enrolled at Portland Harbor. In 1842, there was a horrible storm in the county, and they said that there was more lightning and thunder and rain. It was continuous for hours. And it was such a heavy rain that most of the dams and mills and bridges across our creeks got washed out and washed into Lake Erie. In October of 1842, there was a fire at the harbor, and 3 stores burned and a portion of the dock. And then in November of 1842, there was a terrible storm. 50 vessels were wrecked. 100 sailors and passengers were killed on Lake Erie. And so in December, an inspector came from the Topographical Bureau, and he said the harbor was left in a very unfinished state. There was decay evident. The stones were out of the cribs. The planks were torn up. The top timbers have all been carried off. This is not alone mortifying to our pride. It shows criminal neglect on the part of those to whom these great interests have been entrusted. So there were no federal appropriations during these years, and so I think maybe the work just stopped on this breakwater. And because there was no money to do it, it just started to get, to decay. So the gentleman writing this report said, the government has found the means to indulge in expeditions of curiosity and science. It has money to be wasted on the coast of Africa, but it has no money to expend for the protection of the lives and property of the navigators of the lake, or to remove hidden dangers which are daily strewing our western waters with the lifeless bodies of the industrious and enterprising of our own citizens. So, I think in some ways they was referring to all of that debris that got washed out in that huge storm was interfering with boats' ability to get into the harbor. So that's, I think, why this map was filed. This map was originally drawn in 1837. It wasn't filed in the clerk's office until 1843. And I think it was done, the Portland Harbor Improvement Company changed its name to Barcelona Harbor Improvement Company once the community changed its name. And I think they were trying to show their intent to continue to invest and develop the harbor. And in reality, Jamestown and the interior were still getting most of their goods from the outside world through Barcelona. And so in 1843, the newspaper wrote that you could still often see 15 to 20 teams on the road to Jamestown hauling goods from the harbor. They said that there were stacks of cherry and black walnut lumber running 800 feet to the docks up to the hill that were 12 to 14 feet high, and that the schooner Barcelona ran lumber almost daily between Buffalo and Port Dover. So there was still an awful lot going on here, and people were still very interested in trying to get federal appropriations for the harbor. Unfortunately, in October of 1844 was the great storm that everybody, I think, knows about. So worse than the storm of 1835, it was the worst storm to date. The newspapers reported that the landing, the beach, and the docks were all submerged. The dock and warehouse of John Eason was carried off with goods worth $5,000 to $6,000. His warehouse was actually driven against the rocks below the lighthouse and dashed to splinters. The warehouse of the Barcelona company was moved off its foundation and the pier was damaged. George Patterson wrote to his son that the long pier is mostly gone. All the little buildings are scattered about town. The smut mill, one is in the lake, the other is gone. The road travel to the government workshop is no more. The ore factory and government shops are all gone. So the wooden schooner Pennsylvania was lost off of Barcelona with all hands lost. Damage was extensive. And in 1846, President Polk vetoed all of the money that was in the River and Harbor Improvement Bill because he wanted to use that money to go to war with Mexico, to try to get Arizona, New Mexico, California, Southern California. So there was $500,000 that was supposed to go to the Great Lakes, and we got zero. So in 1846, in November, there was another really large storm, and the brig Osceola sunk not far from Barcelona. The steamer Helen Strong got stranded on the cliffs below the lighthouse, and as it was going to pieces, they were able to drop ropes down the bank and remove 60 passengers with the help of the lighthouse keeper, Joshua Ledoux. 2 people died. The ship Leona was lost. In the next few days, 4 bodies washed ashore. They had a funeral in one of the churches in town, and they opened up a grave large enough for 4 coffins. And as they were walking from the church to the cemetery, another body was brought into the village. It was a colored man, they said, was a cook on one of the ships, and they just added him to the grave. So, don't know if they could determine the names of the people or try to notify anybody. So there was a lot of anger and resentment towards the president for vetoing that bill. And it wasn't just us, it was everyone in the Great Lakes. And so there was a River and Harbor Convention in 1847 held in Chicago, and thousands of people went to that, including Horace Greeley, who, let's see if I have there's another ad. So there's Horace. Might have been about that same time. So Greeley was the editor of the New York Tribune, but his parents had moved to just south of Clymer. So he had come here numerous times previously, and he was a great proponent of promoting the West and its needs and its interests. And so he traveled up Lake Erie to attend the River and Harbors Convention, and he wrote about it all the way up the lake. He wrote about the needs of the different communities and the amount of commerce that was being affected by not having any funding. And the reason I mention it is because Joshua Ledoux was a lighthouse keeper from 1846 to 49. His daughter Mercy wrote a poem about growing up at the lighthouse. And in her poem, she mentioned that Horace Greeley stopped and she gave him a tour because he was interested in the natural gas light. And at the end of the tour, he offered her a coin, and her father said that she couldn't accept it because they were federal employees. And he said, "Oh no, it's not payment, just keep it as a memento of me." And so I kind of wonder if he made that stop while he was headed to or from the convention, because it had to have been between 1846 and 1849, because that's when Ledoux was the lighthouse keeper. So we know he came up in 1847. And the Topographical Bureau reported that same year that the whole of the American coast of Lake Erie being southern, the shipping is exposed to all the violence of the prevailing north winds. This means that harbors are of absolute necessity for protection. The whole amount expended on the American shore for harbor improvements has been $608,000. Appropriations are made year after year but are vetoed. President Polk seems to think the war has made the government too poor for protection of sailors and millions of property, but he has abundant means to explore the Dead Sea. So even though there were no more federal appropriations, in 1848, 2.25 million pounds of butter and cheese were shipped out of Barcelona. Still a lot of commerce going through to Jamestown. In 1852, in November, the Oneida was lost in a storm off Barcelona, and 19 sailors drowned. In 1854, the schooner Missouri, which was carrying coal, lost its mast in a storm and drifted onto a sandbar near the mouth of Portland Harbor, where it broke up and sank. And that reduced the ability for larger ships to enter the harbor. And in 1854, Portland Harbor lost its designation as a port of entry. And in 1856, the Lighthouse Bureau's annual report listed Barcelona as having no harbor. In November, the Secretary of the Treasury gave authority to discontinue the light, but in the newspaper it seems that local appeals were made to William Seward to help us keep the light, and so it was kept until 1859, when finally it was discontinued in July. And a supply vessel came from Buffalo, removed the light apparatus because they had a lighthouse depot for the region in Buffalo, and they took it there so it could be used by another lighthouse. So on July 20th, the Westfield Republican wrote, "The general government has made appropriations for the improvement of the harbor, but under Democratic policy, it was the Westfield Republican, don't forget that. They were allowed to go to ruin by being left incomplete, and a more desolate looking place can hardly be found than Portland Harbor." So that is kind of the sad end of the shipping business at the harbor. And a lot of folks talk about that storm in 1844 as, being one of the prime reasons, and also the railroads. But I think there were enough regular storms that I think it was a constant battle to keep all of the structures and the improvements viable. And then I think it was the loss of federal appropriations that really limited us in our ability to keep those piers repaired. So, of course, the railroads eventually did become a better way to move goods. And, of course, that's what allowed the fishing industry to thrive here. So, by 1859, there was also already a pretty healthy fishing industry at the harbor. So, nothing to lament. The harbor became, viable once again. But it was definitely I think the frequent storms and the loss of federal money that really led to the decline of the business, the commission business. All right, well, thanks for coming.